who is the main character of the MCU right now? Because I think most people would immediately say Spider-Man, and that's completely understandable. Spider-Man is undoubtedly Marvel's biggest character. Brand New Day has only reinforced that. But here's where it gets pretty interesting. Being Marvel's biggest character doesn't necessarily make you the character Marvel is building its universe around. Those two things used to be the same thing. During the Infinity Saga, Tony Stark was arguably both. He was one of Marvel's biggest stars, but he was also tied directly into almost everything. The Avengers existed partly because of Tony. Ultron was his mistake, and Civil War tore apart his relationships. Thanos became personal, and Endgame ultimately ended with Tony. So who fills that position now? I don't think it's Spider-Man. I think Marvel has quietly been positioning Yelena Belova to become one of the most important characters in the entire MCU. And when you actually look at where Marvel keeps putting her, there's a surprisingly strong case. But there's also one massive problem with this argument: Spider-Man. So let's look at both. Let's start with Peter Parker, because if we're talking about the face of the MCU, the conversation lasts about 5 seconds. It's Spider-Man. There's really no point pretending otherwise. He's one of the most recognizable fictional characters in the world, and Brand New Day has only reminded everyone how enormous the character is. But even before that, look at what happened with No Way Home. Marvel put Spider-Man at the center of a multiverse story, brought back characters from completely different eras of Marvel movies, and turned it into one of the biggest events the MCU has ever produced. Peter also has something very few of Marvel's newer characters have: history. We've watched this version of Spider-Man grow up. We met him as a kid in Civil War. Tony recruited him. He fought alongside the Avengers. He died in Infinity War. He came back in Endgame. Then he lost Tony. He lost Aunt May. And by the end of No Way Home, Peter had basically lost everyone. Nobody remembered Peter Parker. And he's alone. And now Brand New Day has taken that version of the character forward. So if someone tells me Spider-Man is the main character of the MCU, I'm not going to tell them they're crazy. There's a very good argument for it. But there's something strange about Peter's position in the wider MCU. Someone who feels this important, Marvel doesn't actually use him very often. And there's a reason for that. Spider-Man exists in a very unusual position. He's an MCU character, yes. Marvel Studios doesn't own the movie rights to Spider-Man. Sony does. That's why these movies are produced through this partnership between Sony and Marvel Studios. And so far, that partnership has obviously worked incredibly well. But it means that Spider-Man isn't a character Marvel can simply move around the MCU whenever it wants. There are agreements and negotiations, different studios involved, and we've already seen how complicated that relationship can become. That's important when you're trying to build an interconnected universe, because imagine you're Marvel and you're planning for years ahead. You want one character appearing in a movie here, a Disney Plus series there, then an Avengers movie, maybe another character's film. You can do this incredibly easy with someone like Yelena. Spider-Man is different, and there's a perfect example of this. When Marvel originally announced the enormous Avengers Doomsday cast, Florence Pugh was there. Yelena was in. Tom Holland, though, wasn't announced. Now, that doesn't mean Spider-Man can't appear. Marvel obviously hides things. Actors lie, and secret appearances happen constantly. And Spider-Man could obviously still become highly important to Secret Wars. But I'm more interested in what Marvel was prepared to publicly build around, because Yelena wasn't a surprise Marvel needed to protect. She was part of the team. And when you look backwards, you can see how Marvel got her there. Yelena arrived in Black Widow, and initially it was pretty obvious what her purpose was. Natasha Romanoff was leaving the MCU. Yelena was the next Black Widow. Simple. Except Marvel didn't treat her like a replacement character who would disappear until Black Widow 2. They immediately started moving her around the universe. Black Widow introduces her, then Hawkeye puts her opposite Clint Barton. And this is where I think Yelena becomes something more than the new Black Widow, because Hawkeye doesn't treat her like a cameo. Her relationship with Natasha becomes part of Clint's story. She wants revenge. She thinks Clint is responsible for Natasha's death. And instead of resolving that in another Black Widow movie, Marvel uses Yelena to connect two completely different corners of the MCU. Then she appears again in Thunderbolts. And this is the big one, because Yelena isn't just another member of that team. She's right at the emotional center of the movie. She's lonely. She's dissatisfied with what her life has become. And she's still carrying Natasha around with her. And the movie builds heavily around Yelena trying to figure out what she's actually doing with her life. That's a very different role from the one she had when she first appeared. She's not just replacing Natasha anymore. Marvel is giving her a story of her own. And by the end, she is now attached to a team that can operate inside the wider MCU, which takes her directly into Avengers territory. And now she's in Doomsday. Think about that progression. Black Widow introduces her, Hawkeye connects her to the wider universe, and then Thunderbolts puts her at the center of an ensemble. Doomsday puts her into an Avengers-level event. That is not random. Marvel has been moving Yelena further towards the center every time she appears. And there's another reason I think they're comfortable doing it. Florence Pugh. This part matters more than people sometimes admit. Marvel isn't just investing in Yelena Belova, they're investing in Florence Pugh. Because if you're going to build a major part of the MCU around somebody, you need an actor who can carry it. And Pugh has become one of the biggest actors of her generation. More importantly, she gives Yelena something the MCU desperately needs right now: personality. Yelena doesn't feel like Natasha 2.0. She can be funny, without turning every scene into a joke. She can be completely ridiculous one minute and genuinely vulnerable the next. And Thunderbolts showed that Marvel trusts her with heavier material. That's important, because one of the problems Marvel has had post-Endgame is that there hasn't been an obvious center. Think about how many potential leads we've had. Doctor Strange, Captain Marvel, Sam Wilson, Shang-Chi, Thor, Spider-Man, Loki. You could make an argument for several of them, but none of them has filled the Tony Stark role. And to be clear, I don't think Marvel should create another Tony Stark. Trying to manufacture another character exactly like him would probably be a mistake. But the MCU does need characters who can move between franchises and make the universe feel connected. That's where Yelena becomes really interesting. Because Marvel can put her almost anywhere. Street level story? Sure, she works. Espionage? Obviously. Avengers? Well, we're already there. Cosmic or multiverse story? Doomsday is about to test that. And because Marvel controls the character, they don't have to negotiate every time they want to use her. But there's also a pretty big argument against everything that I've just said. Maybe Yelena isn't the main character at all. Maybe Marvel doesn't even have one anymore. This is where I think the original question gets a little more complicated, because the Infinity Saga had an obvious center: Tony Stark, Steve Rogers, and to a slightly lesser extent, Thor. Their stories kept colliding with the main Avengers narrative. The Multiverse Saga hasn't really worked like that. Doctor Strange gets one story, Shang-Chi gets another, Sam Wilson gets another, the Fantastic Four arrive, the Thunderbolts arrive, and the X-Men start becoming important. Loki might understand the multiverse better than almost anyone alive, but he's operating in his own corner of the story. Maybe the mistake is assuming somebody has to replace Tony. Maybe Marvel's new model is several central characters rather than one. And if that's the case, Yelena doesn't need to become the new face of Marvel. She just needs to become one of the characters connecting those different pieces together. And I actually think that's a much stronger argument. Because calling Yelena the biggest character in the MCU would be ridiculous. She's not. Spider-Man destroys her in that category. Saying Yelena might become one of the MCU's most important connective characters? Look at where she's going. It's already happening. And that's where we finally get back to Spider-Man. So let's separate three different things. The biggest character in the MCU, Spider-Man. The face of the MCU, still Spider-Man. The character Marvel has the most freedom to build its wider universe around, that's where Yelena has a real advantage. Spider-Man can disappear for years and still come back as one of the biggest characters on Earth. He doesn't need constant MCU appearances to remain relevant. Yelena does. But those appearances also allow Marvel to use her as connective tissue. She's already moved from Natasha's story to Clint's story to the Thunderbolts and now into Doomsday. And there's something else I find interesting. Spider-Man's current story actually has become smaller. And I mean that as a compliment. After No Way Home, Peter has been stripped back. No Avengers, no Stark Tech, no secret identity, no friends who remember him. Brand New Day has been able to focus much more heavily on Peter Parker and Spider-Man again. Yelena is moving in the opposite direction. Her world keeps getting bigger. She started in Natasha's story, then entered Hawkeye's, then became central to her own team. Now that team is colliding with the Avengers. These trajectories are going in completely different directions. That's why I don't think this is really a competition between them. Spider-Man doesn't need to carry the entire MCU. He's Spider-Man. His corner of Marvel is big enough on its own. Yelena can serve a completely different purpose. She can help hold the wider universe together. So, is Yelena Belova actually the main character of the MCU? Not quite. At least, not yet. And I'd actually change my original statement slightly. Spider-Man is still the MCU's biggest star. If we're talking about the character most capable of getting people into a cinema, it's Peter Parker. But if we're asking which character Marvel has quietly been moving closer and closer to the center of the shared universe, Yelena has a much stronger case than I think people realize. Marvel introduced her as Natasha's little sister, then made her part of Hawkeye's story, then put her at the center of the Thunderbolts. And now she's walking into Avengers Doomsday. That's a pretty clear trajectory. And Marvel can use her whenever they want. No Sony negotiations, no rights complications, no wondering whether another studio wants something different. She is theirs. So maybe Yelena isn't replacing Spider-Man. Maybe that's the wrong way of looking at it. Spider-Man is the attraction. He's the character Marvel can disappear for many years, bring back, and immediately turn into an event. Yelena, though, is becoming something else. She's becoming connective tissue. The character who can move between different corners of the MCU and help make this enormous universe feel like one universe again. And after the Multiverse saga spent years feeling like 10 different stories happening at the same time, this might actually be very important. So here's my verdict. Spider-Man is still the face of the MCU, but Yelena Belova might be becoming its spine. And with Doomsday bringing together the Avengers, the Thunderbolts, the Fantastic Four, and the X-Men, we're about to find out just how important Marvel actually thinks she is. So what do you think? Yelena genuinely becoming one of the MCU's central characters? Or are we massively overthinking this and Spider-Man is still the obvious answer? Let me know. But until next time, guys, this has been LFGs, and I'll see you in the next one.
W's in the shot.